Hi, everyone. This is your host, Raven Syed, and welcome back to Forgotten Echoes, a podcast where we dive into the mysterious and unexplained cases of Black women that often get lost in time. Today, we're diving into two separate cases from Chicago's South Side that remain unsolved to this day: the brutal murders of Theresa Bunn and Hazel Lewis. But these two women are not alone. Their deaths are just a fraction of a larger, more disturbing pattern that has been happening in Chicago for almost 3 decades. Dozens of Black women have been murdered under eerily similar circumstances. They've been strangled, discarded in alleys, abandoned buildings, and dumpsters, and their stories largely ignored, and at best, not spoken about enough. We'll comb through the details we do know about Theresa and Hazel's murders, along with the eerie connections between their cases and the slew of unsolved killings that have haunted Chicago for nearly 3 decades. These cases are a mirror, reflecting a crisis that has been unfolding for years. A crisis where Black women continue to be targeted, their disappearances glanced over, and their killers allowed to walk free. And by the end of this episode, you'll wonder, is this the work of a serial killer? Or is it something more insidious, but far more common at play? The systemic neglect of Black femicide. This is episode 8, The Murders of Theresa Bunn and Hazel Lewis. Sources for today's episode include Vocal Media, Roosevelt University, WTTW News, Chicago Tribune, WGN News, and Chicago Sun-Times. Now let's get into the case. Chicago, Illinois is home to nearly 2.7 million people, making it the third largest city in the United States. But despite its size and resources, the city has continuously struggled with an alarmingly high murder rate. Over the years, thousands of homicides have gone unsolved, leaving families without answers and communities without closure. As of recent reports, Chicago's overall murder clearance rate hovers around the 50% mark, meaning nearly half of all homicide cases remain open with no arrest and no accountability. But when we break down those numbers further, a stark disparity emerges. Black women make up a significant portion of these unsolved cases. Their murders are less likely to receive media coverage, less likely to be solved, and less likely to see justice. In 2023, WTTW News released the article named "Homicide Clearance Rate Lower in Chicago's Black Communities." The report stated, quote, "In 2021, there were 800 homicides counted. The clearance rate by prosecution was 21.7% in predominantly Black neighborhoods, yet 45.6% in predominantly white neighborhoods. The study also found that since 2001, the rate of unsolved homicides for Black women is at 35% compared to 23% for white women." Quote, "This pattern isn't new, and it hasn't gone unnoticed. In fact, there's one case file that stands out above the rest, a series of unsolved murders so haunting it's been given a name: the Chicago 51. Between 1999 and 2018, 75 women ages 18 to 58 were strangled to death in Chicago. By the end of 2019, only 24 of those cases have been solved. The remaining 51 share more similarities than differences. The term Chicago 51 refers to a pattern identified by the Murder Accountability Project, a nonprofit that analyzes homicide trends across the country. Most of the women, Black, were found murdered across the city. The vast majority of them were strangled, their bodies dumped in similar ways. The victims spanned a wide age range, as I mentioned, but they all shared a common fate: brutal violence, no arrest, and despite all of that, the cases received very little public attention and media coverage. The sheer number of similar cases raised a terrifying possibility. Was this the work of a serial killer, or multiple killers operating in the same hunting grounds, targeting the same demographic of vulnerable women? Experts, activists, and even former law enforcement officials have pointed out that the patterns are strikingly similar to what we've seen in other cities with confirmed serial predators. And for all my true crime folks out there, my mind immediately went to the Grim Sleeper in Los Angeles, Samuel Little, that was a predator across the entire country, and the Chicago killer, aka John Wayne Gacy. Yet, despite mounting evidence and pressure from the community, Chicago police have never officially acknowledged the possibility of a serial killer. Instead, the cases remain scattered, treated as isolated crimes rather than pieces of a larger puzzle. So how did we get here? How did all these women go missing, were murdered, and ended up discarded like trash without a single arrest in connection to their deaths? Today's story will cover two women who are part of the Chicago 51. It was November 2007. Halloween had just passed a couple weeks prior. The air was cold but crisp, as it had been raining on and off for the past few days. With the holidays just around the corner, the streets were bustling on Chicago's South Side. And among the crowd was 21-year-old Theresa Bunn. Theresa Marie Bunn was born on January 1st, 1986 in Chicago, Illinois, to mother Rosemary Williams, and was the oldest of 5 siblings. From what I've read, Theresa was really close with her siblings and family. Being the oldest daughter comes with its own pressures and whatnot. If you know, you know. But Theresa was the glue that held her siblings together and embraced the role with ease. At 18, she graduated from Englewood High School, and her friends said she was known for her love of music and just being a teen that loved to have fun. Theresa had a big personality, which people didn't expect, as she was a petite woman standing 5 foot tall even and 135 pounds soaking wet. Friends and family also described her as friendly and someone who was quick to pick up people's spirits. LaQuisha Harris, a friend of Theresa's, stated, quote, "She was the quiet one, the one to make peace," quote. And that's not it. Theresa was also a mother-to-be. She was 8 months pregnant, expecting a baby boy, whom she'd already named Michael Pierre Terry Bunn. Theresa was nervous, but equally excited to step into this new phase of her life. But unfortunately, she would never get the opportunity to meet her son Earthside. Monday, November 12th, started off as any other day. Theresa was in contact with friends and family throughout the day and seemed to be in good spirits. She told her family she would be spending the evening running errands and would be shopping in either Chicago or Evergreen Park. But that was the last time anyone received an update from her, and she never returned home. As the hours went by, Theresa's mother began to worry and thought that due to a mental condition, she might have gotten confused. That mental condition was never disclosed, but nonetheless, her family was extremely concerned because Theresa was 8 months pregnant. Later that Monday, just before midnight, firefighters responded to a fire in a dumpster along the 61st 100th block of South Prairie Avenue near Washington Park. What they discovered was horrific. A badly burned, unrecognizable body. As police entered the scene, it was obvious the woman in the dumpster had been strangled, stripped naked, and was obviously pregnant. Her body was covered in a flammable accelerant and then set ablaze. She was so badly burned that by the time police found her, they needed dental records to confirm her identity, which would take 3 days or so to get back. No purse or ID were found at the crime scene. As the news that a dead body was found spread locally, her family held on a hope, desperately praying that the burned and battered body discovered in a dumpster that night didn't belong to their beloved Theresa. The gruesome nature of the crime, the strangulation, the fire, the careless disposal, was almost too horrific to comprehend. But as the days passed without a word from her, dread began to creep in. She was the first of 2 women found murdered in an eerily similar fashion that same week, and her family feared the worst. And yes, you heard me right. She was the first victim of 2 who was murdered in the similar circumstances within the week. But hang tight, we'll get there. Finally, on Thursday, November 15th, detectives arrived at the family's home to deliver the news no family should ever hear. Your daughter, your sister, your nephew, your grandson was murdered. Within moments, the quiet of their Englewood Street was shattered with raw, gut-wrenching wails. Running outside, Theresa's sister sobbed, "She's dead! She's dead! My sister's gone!" while collapsing to the ground. Neighbors came out of their home, frozen on their porches, stunned in silence. Others watched, their faces etched with sorrow, knowing this was another tragedy in a city that had seen far too many. Quote, "She was just innocent and full of life," said friend Jarvis Frazier. "There's no way in God's world she should have been found in a garbage can, burned up." Quote. Overcome with emotion, family members consoled one another as tears streamed down their faces. Their worst fears have been realized. Theresa was gone, and with her, the future of a child she never got the chance to hold. Theresa was 21 years old, 8 months pregnant, and preparing for the arrival of her baby boy. She didn't bother anyone. Her murder was a shock to friends and family. And I can only imagine so because, wow, this is devastating for a multitude of reasons. And there are many layers on why this case is so disturbing. The fact that she was only weeks away from giving birth when she was murdered, to the fact that her body was violated in so many ways, including being stripped nude, strangled, and lit on fire. And for the fact that she was left in a dumpster like a piece of trash. Seriously, the list could go on forever. I just will never understand the psyche of murderers or how people just like you and I could be this evil. Police quickly looked for possible motives, and her family did disclose Theresa had faced some personal struggles recently, including a protection order she filed against the man she claimed to be her child's father. Apparently, she accused him and his mother of harassment, while he denied the relationship entirely. This tension led to her own arrest after violating the order. But a further investigation into this theory led Chicago PD nowhere, as the man she claimed to be her child's father was never publicly named a suspect, or that's at least what I gathered from different source material. Authorities had little time to process Theresa's murder before another tragedy quickly followed. Just 2 days after finding Theresa's body, at 1 a.m. on November 14th, a deceased body was found on 834th East 50th Street in Kenwood, less than 2 miles away from Theresa's crime scene. The victim was identified as 52-year-old Hazel Lewis. Like Theresa, she had been stripped naked, strangled, and set on fire. The similarities were glaring, leading many to believe that these 2 murders were connected. But who was Hazel Lewis? Hazel was a woman with a life of history, and she had so many people in her life that cared about her. She was a mother to 3 daughters and was a proud grandma. She was born in Mississippi in the 1950s and spent her younger adult years going back and forth between her hometown in Chicago, until finally settling on the Windy City. Hazel Lewis spent one of her final nights at a pumpkin patch with her granddaughter, fulfilling her grandbaby's wish. And this was normal for Hazel. She had a big heart, not just for her family, but her community. Her family said that Hazel was known for distributing food to the homeless people in her South Side neighborhood. Her cousin Renee Perry stated, quote, "She took care of everyone. She was a very giving person," quote. After the pumpkin patch visit on October 30th, Lewis dropped her granddaughter back off at her older daughter's house and then returned to the home she shared with her fiancé on South Evans Avenue. And that was the last time her daughter saw her. Lewis disappeared about 10 days later, according to family members. Fast forward to November 14th, and firefighters found her body, strangled and burned in a garbage can behind Revis Elementary School. And investigators couldn't deny there were glaring similarities between the two murders. Both women were strangled, both were stripped nude, which hinted at the crimes being sexually motivated. Both were found within a few blocks of Washington Park on Chicago's South Side, and both women were African American. And to top it all off, given the uniquely gruesome way of their bodies being incinerated in garbage cans, investigators couldn't help but think, is there a possibility of a serial killer at work? And before I move on, I just want to say a few words for Hazel, because when I was doing research for this case, while both cases really didn't produce any type of true national media coverage, and both of them were kind of forgotten about and glanced over, I feel like between the two, Hazel's really was overshadowed because she was the second victim to be found right after Theresa. So while people were still talking about Theresa's murder, Hazel was found, and she was a little bit older, and I just think her case really slipped through the cracks. And when I envisioned Hazel, I pictured the community matriarch that was everybody's mom, auntie, or grandma in some way, shape, or form. She looked out for everyone, and it just seems like she really took pride in her community. She seemed really hardworking, really kind, and just somebody that really cared for the people that were in her life. Like, feeding the homeless on the exact same block you live on speaks volumes about her character and the type of woman she was. And just like Theresa, her murder was sickening for a plethora of reasons. The selfishness of the crime, how she was disposed of like garbage, and the fact that she was set on fire. I just don't understand how anyone could be this evil. I just will never understand it, and I would hope you don't either. Now, in the days following their murders, Chicago Police Department publicly acknowledged the similarities. Monique Bond, a spokeswoman for the department, stated, quote, "There are similarities in the manner of death and how the bodies were disposed of," quote. Yet despite this, the investigation stalled and quickly went cold. No arrest, no suspects, no updates. And I wish the story ended here, but it doesn't. Theresa and Hazel were just two of a shocking 51 women murdered in Chicago between 1999 and 2018. The majority of the victims were Black women, many of them strangled, many found in dumpsters, alleyways, and vacant lots. And as I mentioned earlier, the Murder Accountability Project, a nonprofit that tracks homicide patterns, flagged these cases as likely the work of a serial killer dubbed the Chicago Strangler. Founder Thomas Hargrove stated, quote, "If you look at these cases, it's classic. It couldn't be more serial looking," quote. And yet, despite growing pressure from activists and growing evidence, the Chicago Police Department refused to confirm whether a serial killer was at work. In 2019, then Superintendent Eddie Johnson launched an internal investigation, but simultaneously publicly downplayed the serial killer theory. He made the comment, quote, "Trust me, if there was, there would be no reason for us not to share that with y'all," he said. "What would we gain by not being transparent? Literally nothing," quote. And I understand what he's saying, but there are several reasons why Chicago PD may not want to disclose they have their suspicions that there's a serial killer. One, to be considered a serial killer, you need to kill 2 or more people. And of the Chicago 51, there are several victims' cases that closely resemble each other in MO. Not to mention, I just showed you 2 of them. In my opinion, I think it's impossible not to entertain the possibility of a serial killer, especially when you're referring to Hazel and Theresa. Outside of the unsolved cases of the Chicago 51, Chicago doesn't have the best stats for solved murders, so there is the possibility that investigators don't want to admit there might be a serial killer walking among everyone because they know with that admission will come some accountability and more pressure from higher-ups to get these cases solved. Not to mention pressure from the victims' families. I also believe they may know there is a possibility of a serial killer, but due to a lack of concrete evidence, they'd rather not say so just to avoid the mass hysteria. And lastly, they may know there is a serial killer, but might be keeping this information private until more evidence emerges. Who knows? But one thing is for certain. Some of these cases were committed by the same offender, and I believe Theresa and Hazel are an example of that. At some point, I would love to do a short series on the Chicago 51 because seriously, this is just the tip of the iceberg. I could go down a rabbit hole, but I will save that rabbit hole for a proper episode. And my last point that I should have mentioned earlier, but I'll use the opportunity to do so now, is that throughout the episode, I say that the time span of the 51 women that were murdered in Chicago, coined as the Chicago 51, started in 1999 and ended in 2018. Just want to throw out there that in some reports, I do see some conflicts, and some reports say that the time span is actually 2001 to 2018. So just throwing that out there, I saw majority reports say that it was 1999, but just in case you see something different, I'm not 100% certain where the first case started or when it started, but I went with 1999 because majority of the reports I read go off of that time span. So fast forward, and for the families left behind, the lack of answers is devastating. Theresa Bunn's father, Anthony McCrae, still waits for justice. He states, quote, "To me, this is her last place," he said, standing at the vacant lot where her body was found. "It shouldn't be here. They took our baby and burned her like she was garbage." Quote. Theresa's family didn't even hold a funeral. Her remains were too badly burned. Instead, they held a vigil at the site where she was discarded, a place that should never have been her final resting place. A mother and her unborn child reduced to ashes in an abandoned dumpster. In Hazel Lewis's case, received even less attention. Her murder was largely overshadowed by the growing list of unsolved homicides. But her life mattered. Her story mattered. And yet, she remains another statistic in a city that has allowed so many women like her to slip through the cracks. 18 years later, Theresa and Hazel's murders remain unsolved. Their names are a part of a larger mystery, one that points to systemic failures, disregard for Black women's safety, and possibly a serial predator that has not answered for their crimes. Theresa's father pleaded, quote, "This time, it's our daughter, but it could be your daughter, your niece, your mother next. We as a community need to help one another." Quote. We must ask ourselves, how many more women need to die before we pay attention? How many more Black women must be erased before their stories finally matter? Professor John Fountain, a journalism professor at Roosevelt University, who has tirelessly advocated for the victims, said this about the case.
Professor Fountain doesn't want this to be a story about race, but he says it's hard to ignore the obvious.
And I am convinced that if there were 51 dogs that were killed in the city of Chicago, the city would be up in arms. And we aren't with these women who have been killed. And we have to change that in society to understand that every life matters.
Now here's the call to action. If you have any information about the murders of Theresa Bunn or Hazel Lewis, or any of the 51 murdered women in Chicago, please contact the Chicago Police Department at area code 312-746-6000. But most importantly, keep sharing their stories, keep saying their names, and keep demanding justice. Theresa Bunn, Hazel Lewis, the Chicago 51, you're not just a statistic, you're not trash, and you are most definitely not forgotten. Sending light and love to the Bunn and Lewis family. Thank you for tuning in to episode 8 of Forgotten Echoes. Please do me a favor and show your support by following the podcast, liking, subscribing, and sharing this episode. And if you feel so inclined to do so, please leave a 5-star review on whatever platform you're listening to this episode from. It really helps and I really appreciate it. I'm Raven Syed, and I'll see you next week with another case that needs to be remembered. Stay vigilant, stay aware, and keep the echoes of the forgotten alive. I'll see you soon.